everyone, and welcome to our first class in European Social History. This is an upper division European History class, with a unique perspective and take, which I hope you guys will appreciate. Okay, so a little background. Who has actually heard of what social history is? Because it's a different type of history. Maybe, maybe not. Okay, so this was pulled from an article from History Today, which is an online periodical publication, kind of like a review site. And I think it's fitting. It's like, what is social history? A new form of antiquarianism, celebrating experience at the expense of analysis, sort of history socialist right, perhaps, rescuing the past from the enormous condensation of posterity, mobilizing popular enthusiasm. What is it, right? So that's what this class is going to kind of explore, and the way that we're going to explore it is through the 19th century and social movements within that, primarily focusing in Central Europe. So I'm not going to go too much into Great Britain because that's a whole nother class which would take a lot longer. So instead we're going to kind of focus on specifically France, Vienna, Germany, that type of thing. We're going to, instead of going through political history and events and that type of thing, we're going to look at how themes of Enlightenment, nationalism, liberalism, and expressionism actually affected general society at large. So that's kind of what we're going to be doing. The ultimate goal is to be able to, the way that we end the course is going to be looking at the causation of World War I. So the way I've kind of geared this is to be this is the build-up, this is the century that led to the 20th century with 2 world wars, and there's a reason for that. So we're going to kind of look at that and try and connect the dots a little bit, so to speak. Okay, so social history. Right, so it's a field of history that looks at the lived experiences of the past. So for example, it's not about a king's reign and foreign policy, it's going to be about what art society was interested in during that time period. In my opinion, a lot more interesting than reading about wars, so hopefully you guys will like it. This is a new social history. It kind of exploded on the scene in the 1960s, so it's relatively new, and in fact still kind of controversial today. The article that I just referenced uses 7 different perspectives of what social history is. I think the complexity is actually helpful in understanding because there's no universal meaning behind it. You can kind of create it as you go, which is neat. We're actually going to read one of the greats from the 60s. Karl Schorsky is a great social historian. We're going to read sections of his book, Fond de Siècle, which is about Vienna at the turn of the century. It's a great book. And he kind of helped create this genre, so to speak. Yeah. So it's a subdivision of historiography that focuses on social structures and processes. So that's another aspect of this class. It's going to be kind of heavily based on historiography instead of just in history, which is cool. The Germans called it Gesellschaftsgeschichte, which means the society history, literally translation. And we're going to look at a lot of German society, so that's why I threw that in there. Yeah. Here we go. So how's this going to work? So it's going to be a little bit different. It's going to be pretty heavy in reading, but I think that's going to be great. We're going to look at primary sources and secondary sources, as well as having responses, both in class and weekly responses. The primary sources I'm assigning are novels primarily, because I think the literature movements tend to be really encapsulate and showcase exactly what was happening in society at the time. And there's a couple secondary sources. There's a really good textbook, which we're going to be going through. It's A Modern History of Europe by John Mearman. So that's going to be a required book as well. It's fantastic because it gives events and political stuff, gives you the historical context that you need in order to understand what was going on. Yeah, and then, right, and Schorsky's book is the other main secondary source as a historian. Okay, so structure, I kind of said that already. discussions in class, it's going to be a lot of discussion led. I'm going to try and keep lectures brief and expect you guys to keep up on the reading in order to know what's going on. So I'm going to start out with a fun activity to try and give you a handle of what this is going to be like. So these are excerpts from some of the readings that are going to be assigned. We have 4, which I did not think about before. I'll pull them up. They'll be on this slide too. Let me just show you. That. All right. Okay. Okay. So the first one that we're looking at, which you can see in your page, I'm not going to tell you exactly where it's from or whatever yet. Instead, I'm just going to have you read it. You can read it up on the board or on the paper for a minute. Once everyone's done, just give me a little signal. Okay. Yeah, you guys have the paper so you can keep going. The second one is this. Starting where the little arrow is because it's just how PDF was. Okay, we're going to look into that, and then the last one right here. Okay, so what we're doing next, so a little activity. All right, so we can have a bit of a discussion. We want you to have these questions in mind. In this, just for time, you guys want to discuss it together first? I'm going to let you guys decide. Want to discuss it together first or just kind of have a pop-up discussion? Pop-up. You want me to pop-up? Okay, cool. So yeah, so now that you've read all 3 articles, we're going to try and answer the question how these fit together. What can be learned about society in the 19th century? They're all written in various time periods, which I did on purpose. And does anything in particular stand out? One of the first one you read is a secondary source, the other 2 are primary sources. There's some heads up. So, anybody, you go. Oh, so many. Someone else go. Kyle, we'll start with you.
So I was seeing themes about industrialization in the second one, just talking about and chimneys and smoke, but I also, I guess, kind of saw hints of romanticism, talking about glimmers of lights and the dirty windows and all that, and so you see the clash of those 2 big themes.
Yeah, that is very key. It's such a big part of the 19th century. The dichotomy between romanticism and living in a world full of steel and smoke. Okay, Rhea?
I loved in the first one, it says, talking about the anxiety resulting from civic failure. We must take leave of a world before it collapses, he wrote in 1905. Many know it already, and an indefinable feeling makes poets out of many. I just think I really like that, especially like all of the art that's ever come out of like social movements or political unrest is always like, you know, it's changed the world. And so, yeah, I don't know. I just really like that. I could ponder on that for probably a while.
Yeah, that is part of the reason why I assigned that particular reading. His style is, it really makes you think and grapple with a lot of ideas, which I love.
I actually just had a question. So
Yeah.
in the first one, was this written, because wasn't Vienna like restructured according to like the social structure
Yeah,
at that time?
yeah, it
Like,
totally was.
was this before or after, during that?
This is the secondary source, so this is Shorsky's take on Vienna.
Okay.
Yeah, that I'm gonna be going into Vienna a little bit more because it is the climax, so to speak, of the 19th century, in a lot of different ways. And you're totally right, it was totally restructured, literally geographically restructured
Yeah, to fit the social.
to fit the social order of that time. Yeah, so that's gonna be a big theme. Yeah, thank you. That's totally. Alex.
I was going to comment again on the art as an expression of
Mhm.
like this indefinable feeling of anxiety and social change, because that's like what my political class is.
Yeah, oh yeah,
Like-
it's universal. It doesn't matter what
Yeah.
time period it's in or anything.
Anything like that is like so interesting.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah, certainly. Anyone else? Well, let's go back to some of these questions which I brought up. Right, so do they all kind of fit together? Can you kind of get like a theme of some of the general ideas of what society was, what was important, so to speak? Yeah, Alex?
Like it's this era of restructuring, like physically and socially and in so many ways, and like that's what this like, and that's what ties them all together. Like this first one is talking about how he's taking these artistic expressions to like to deal with this change he doesn't know how to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
The whole everything with romanticism is they don't know how to deal with these steel factories, so they're romanticizing this image of like the outdoors and the light and all these things because they're losing it and they don't know how to handle that change. And then
100%,
the last one on like our social structure is changing again. It's all these no one knows how to
Tensions.
handle
Yeah,
this.
yeah, that's totally true. Okay, continuing on. Alright, so a big theme in this class is going to be looking at Vienna. Like we talked about, it's kind of was like in the 1880s all the way through to World War I. This was where culture was sat. This is where all the artists lived. This is where a lot of political movements came from. Vienna is hugely important. I incorporated this photo, which is not like a normal picture of like what Vienna the city looked like, but I did this on purpose because we see a typical middle class to upper class living room. This is what your world looked like. You had the men sitting in the parlor reading newspapers, reading books, that type of thing. Women tended to have leisurely activities, which we're going to discuss later on. It was a world that glittered. I guess that's the right word for it. The French had a saying, "La belle époque," which is the final moment, the ultimate reaching, which I mean, Paris had this as well, of course, but Vienna was more the seat of intellectual movements, which kind of tended, and political movements, so that's kind of why it was a bit more of a direct effect on World War I. The other big point to make is that they lived in a dichotomous world. It was gorgeous. They completely restructured the city. The Ringstrasse, if you guys ever go to Vienna, you will see it's a giant boulevard that surrounds all the main national buildings. The palace, the parliament, I mean everything. Museums, that type of thing. And it's all in neo-colonial look, with columns, kind of like, a little bit like what DC was structured after, actually. So that's kind of what it looks like. And it was purposely done to try and give social order. The emperor at that time had a lot of money. This is at the height of the Habsburg Empire in about 1850. But then, as social movements were changing, especially with what we're going to look at later, with the whole socialist, like the actual socialist movement with Marx and Engels and everything like that, they lost power. They were slowly declining. By, 1899, the whole empire was was slipping away. The final, you can go to the palace and learn about the final emperor and empress. She's great, by the way. I really like learning about her. But they felt it. Their money was low. They had to give up more and more executive power to other politicians. And so we're going to look at that. An interesting point that I want to make known, especially in light of World War II, is that there was a unique phenomenon happening in Vienna in the sense that Jews were fully accepted during this time period, more so than just about anywhere else. Jews had ultimate freedom, which historically they've been very oppressed in Europe, and of course, the precursor to the Holocaust. But they were allowed into full bourgeoisie, middle-class society. In fact, they did very well. In fact, a lot of these authors and social movement leaders were Jewish. So I think we're going to learn a little bit more about that later on. It's an important aspect of Vienna in this sense. It quickly changed. After World War I, they needed a scapegoat in order to blame someone, and that ended up being the Jewish people. Vienna is in Austria, of course. It's not in Germany, but they were annexed relatively early on in the wars. Yeah, here we go. So that one kind of tied in with the first reading, right? Vienna. So the second reading I'm going to discuss a little bit more is Émile Zola, who is a very famous French novelist. He's written a lot, very prolific and a very controversial figure. He actually was involved, interestingly enough, in trying to help a Jewish man wrongly accused for a crime. He was very much against anti-Semitism, which is interesting. So French industrialism, I incorporated this picture as kind of like a visual piece for the actual reading piece that you read, because there's a lot of smoke, there's chimneys. This course will look at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, but I'm more interested in its later effects in the latter half of the 19th century, once it's been established. So this book that you just read part of, Germinal. Germinal means to be seeding, like rebirth, germination, that type of thing. He saw this time period as a regeneration of something. And who is at the heart of it? The working man. This is how we see the social tide shifting, is in his book. Etienne, the main character, which we're going to read a little bit about, is a miner. He lives his life. It's all written from his perspective. This is what he saw. Zola is known for kind of encompassing this interesting literature movement called realism and naturalism, which is supposed to be strictly to the facts. This is kind of how I can say it. So it's written very straightforwardly. There's tons of description. It's not really imagery necessarily, because it's not like within one's own mind, but it's like what you see is what you get. And he did this on purpose because this world that he lived in was harsh for a lot of people. They were surrounded by brick and cold and soot. So naturalism kind of, it's less about the Catholic Church and traditional values. It's more about being yourself as a human. Humans are humans. We do everything that's good to that. So he brought about the good end of that. And then incorporated it with socialism. So that's why this piece is unique, is because he takes the French realist movement, which is an offshoot of Romanticism. So that's how that fits in. Romanticism would have tended to be generally German, which we're actually going to read Faust by Goethe, which is the ultimate romantic German novel, because that's going to be a key aspect as well. But this is a little bit later on, and that kind of came from that other movement. Anyway, so yeah, new society, rebirth for common man. So, and what's interesting, why this I'm incorporating it into social history is because it was hugely popular, like hugely popular. Like it sold out. It was a bestseller. And what's interesting is that it wasn't a bestseller for the middle class and the upper classes. It was a bestseller for all the working men. In fact, they shouted. They had like a chant when the bookstore came out with like more copies. Germinal, Germinal, or they were very excited about it. He thinks that this is his masterpiece. He's very proud of it. Always. So, yep. So because of that, this particular book had a real change on society. So that's why we're gonna do that. All right, communism. Can't really go throughout the 19th century without talking about communism. So the third piece that you read was, of course, the famous introduction in Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto, which came out in, I have that wrong, I looked it up, I wasn't sure it was 49 or 48, it's 48, which is interesting because this was also the year of the revolutions of 1848 across all of Europe. So that's how we're going to tie that in, is the literature and art movement that was happening during a massive political upheaval. We're going to say this a little more early on in the semester because it was mid-century. So he wrote this, we're going to read it, of course, the whole thing. It's not long. It's like, it was meant to be a booklet to be dispersed, so it's not like crazy long. And it's actually, when you read it, it's good. Like, you read it and you're like convinced. You're like, communism is good. Yes, we like it. And because it was a utopian ideal. It gave hope to the hopeless. Especially, of course, the Russian peasants took it up quite literally. Russia was a very backward society. They still had fiefdoms and peasants during this time period, so we're going to look at that a little bit as well. So he created this world, an intellectual world, which I should add, because intellectualism as a movement was exploding. Something I failed to mention earlier, we're also going to look a little bit at intellectualist movements and the birth of, with Max Weber, the birth of socialism. Okay, anyway, so we're going to be looking at some of those. We're also going to look at Freud, who was in Vienna at the time, and the birth of psychology. So that's going to be fun. Obviously, this had a massive impact with World War I, especially because in 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution happened when they took Marx's words and took it to action during World War I in Russia. Okay? Right, so all of these authors played a very important role in social history, especially when it came to World War I. They all had differing ideas. They all came from different backgrounds, which I found fascinating. Hopefully you guys will as well. They all had popular following, which is key, especially social history, because I want it to be what was popular at the time, what was relevant at the time. They were all very well-known authors that we're going to be looking at some more. I know the secondary source, he was also popular just later on, but he's a great source in describing other primary sources, which is why I'm incorporating that. They also focus on historical and social commentary. It's very important in getting a greater idea of how regular social movements have major effects on grand-scale history. So we're going to be looking at the small things in order to understand the bigger things. Are there any questions about what this is about? Anything in the class?